Thermopylae went quiet. 300 Spartan corpses cooled in the dirt of the narrow pass, their bronze plates split, crusted black with blood. Above them, a stake rose from the ground. A head was jammed onto the top, the eyes still open, fixed on the road south. It was the head of a king. What was left of Leonidas? Xerxes, lord of Persia, had given the order himself. Killing a king was not enough. The body had to be defiled. The soul had to be insulted. The flesh had to be left for the carrion birds. As the echoes of the battle faded from the cliffs, a different sound rose in their place. 200,000 boots moving south. A river of iron and leather flowing toward a single target. Athens stood naked. Her temples would be torched. Her altars would be fouled. This was no longer war. This was a desecration of a whole people. But the shame of a nation is a distant thing. The shame of one man lives under his skin and never sleeps. In Sparta, a man named Aristodemus walked through familiar streets, and no one looked at him. 2 Spartans had survived the slaughter at the Hot Gates. He was one of them, sent away from the line because of a wound that had blinded him with infection. His brother in arms had chosen differently. That man had groped his way back into the chaos, half blind, and died on his feet. Aristodemus had gone home. For that choice, the city gave him a new name. Aristodemus, the Trembler, the coward. Spartan law did not bend. He was cut off from every hearth. No one spoke a word to him. No one would share a flame to light his fire. If he stepped into a wrestling yard, the men inside walked out. He moved through Sparta like smoke. A living warning. A man punished for the one crime the city could not pardon. He was already dead in their eyes. All that remained was for his body to catch up to the verdict. In the smoking shell of Athens, an oath was sworn. Not on parchment, not before any council. An oath made in ash and silence, lodged in the belly of every free Greek. Sparta heard it. The city that had given up its king now prepared to spend its future to answer the debt. From the valley of the Eurotas marched the largest force of Spartiates the city had ever sent into the field. 5,000 hoplites, the most lethal infantry the ancient world ever forged. They were not chasing land. They were not hunting gold. They were marching to wipe a name off the earth. This is the story of how the pride of a man who called himself a god lit a fire that would consume his empire. The story of an army of avengers, led by the nephew of the beheaded king, marching to collect a price written in blood. And buried inside their column walked a coward. A man who no longer wanted to win. He wanted to drown in slaughter and find a clean death inside it. Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. Take a second to subscribe and support this project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand the man who put Leonidas on a stake, stop picturing a king. Xerxes I of Persia did not see himself as a ruler. He saw himself as weather, a landslide with a face, a storm wearing a crown. His will was not a decision. It was the same kind of force that pulls a stone to the ground. He had inherited the throne in 486 BC from his father Darius, the same Darius whose army had been broken at Marathon 4 years earlier. That defeat had never been answered. It hung over the Persian court like an unpaid debt. Xerxes spent 6 years preparing the answer. According to Herodotus, who is our chief source for these events, the muster drew men from 46 nations. Lydians in embroidered tunics, Ethiopians painted half white and half red, Indian archers with cane bows, Bactrians, Sakai in pointed caps, Egyptians carrying boarding pikes. The empire was emptied into a single column and pointed west. Before he ever stepped on Greek soil, he reached the Hellespont, that narrow channel of water between Asia and Europe, the strait we now call the Dardanelles. His engineers had bridged it twice, once with linen cables and once with papyrus, lashed across the decks of more than 600 ships anchored in the current. It was the most ambitious piece of military engineering the ancient world had ever attempted. A storm came in the night and tore both bridges apart. A normal king would have ordered a third. Xerxes ordered a punishment. He had the chief engineers beheaded on the shore where the wreckage washed up. Then he had the sea flogged. Herodotus gives the number as 300 lashes, swung by his own soldiers into the waves. As they struck, they shouted the curse he had written for them. Bitter water. Your master delivers this punishment because you injured him, when he had never injured you. Then they brought out branding irons. Red metal hissed into the salt. He marked the strait like a runaway slave. A pair of fetters was thrown into the current to make the symbolism complete. He was not done. To avoid the rocky waters around Mount Athos, where his father's fleet under Mardonius had been smashed in 492 BC, he refused to sail around the peninsula. He cut through it. For 3 years, gangs of laborers from across the empire chipped a canal through solid stone, 1.5 miles long, wide enough for 2 warships to pass side by side. The trench can still be traced today in the soil of the Athos Isthmus. He carved a wound into the earth and forced the coastline to bend for him, not because the route was needed, because he wanted the proof. In the spring of 480 BC, the column began to move. Herodotus claims 1,700,000 fighters. Modern historians read the figure as propaganda and settle somewhere between 100 and 200,000 soldiers, with as many camp followers behind them. Either number is staggering for the era. The line of march stretched so far that the head of it was drinking from rivers the tail had not yet reached. Towns the army passed through were ordered to feed it for a single day. Some of those towns were ruined for a generation by that single day. This was the figure who now led that column into Greece. Not an army of conquest, an instrument of punishment dressed in iron, aimed at one city, Athens. To get to her, he first had to pass Thermopylae. We already know what happened there in August of 480 BC. 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies held the pass for 3 days until a local man named Ephialtes sold them out for Persian silver, leading the immortals along the goat path of the Anapaea trail. Leonidas died. His head went on the stake. The road south opened. When the Persian column finally reached the gates of Athens in September, the city was hollow. The oracle at Delphi had spoken in riddles weeks before. The wooden wall, the Pythia said, would be the only thing that did not fall. She added a second line that everyone tried to forget. Divine Salamis, you will bring death to women's sons. Themistocles, an Athenian commander born in the deme of Phraarioi, the son of a man named Neocles, read those words as a verdict on the fleet. Wood meant ships. He had spent the previous 3 years arguing for a navy when the assembly wanted to spend the silver from the Laurian mines as cash payments to citizens. He had won that argument by a narrow vote. 200 new triremes had been laid down on the slipways at Piraeus. Now he pushed, threatened, and begged his people until they agreed to a second impossible thing. They left their homes. They loaded what they could into boats. They sailed for the island of Salamis, for the coast of Troezen, for the rocky shore of Aegina. Plutarch records that as the evacuation began, a snake disappeared from the temple of Athena on the Acropolis. The priests took it as a sign that the goddess herself had left the city. Themistocles seized on the omen and used it to break the last of the resistance. If the goddess had walked out, who were they to stay? The streets emptied. When the first Persian scouts entered Athens, their boots echoed against shuttered doors. They found loaves of bread on tables, wine still in cups, workshops with tools laid out for a day of labor that never came, wooden dolls forgotten on a doorstep, charcoal still warm in a baker's oven, a city frozen mid-breath. But not every soul had left. A handful of Athenians had read the oracle differently. They believed the wooden wall meant the old palisade up on the Acropolis, the sacred ridge at the city's center. Priests, treasury keepers, old men who refused to die anywhere except next to their gods. There were also those too poor to pay for a place on a boat, slaves left behind by masters in too much of a hurry. They piled timber against the gates and waited. The Persians came up the slope laughing. The immortals, the 10,000 of Xerxes' personal guard, whose ranks were filled the moment any soldier fell, led the assault. They fired arrows wrapped in burning pitch, and the dry wood of the palisade caught fast. The defenders rolled stones down the cliff face, cracking helmets and breaking spines on the men below. Herodotus says the assault stalled for days. The siege had to be conducted from the lower slope called the Areopagus, the same hill where, in calmer years, the Council of Athens debated murder trials. For a few hours, the priests held. They had nothing else to give but their hands and their hate. Then, a small Persian scouting party found something the defenders had not guarded: a crack in the rock on the northern face. A narrow path up the back of the cliff, used by no one in living memory except a few goatherds. They climbed it in silence, hand over hand, knives in their teeth. When they reached the top, they came up behind the defenders. The killing was quick. Those who survived the first cuts ran to the temples. They wrapped their arms around the bronze legs of the statues. They pressed their faces against the marble of the gods, begging for sanctuary on holy stone. The Persians did not pause. They cut them down at the altars. Blood pooled in the grooves where worshippers had once poured wine for Athena. The smell of incense mixed with the smell of opened bowels. The desecration was methodical. Soldiers stripped gold leaf from the statues with the points of their daggers. They smashed pottery older than their grandfathers' grandfathers. They pissed into the eternal fires that the priestesses had tended for 2 centuries without a single night of darkness. They pulled down the statues of the tyrant slayers Harmodius and Aristogeiton, the bronze figures of the 2 lovers who had been Athenian symbols of freedom for 60 years, and carted them back to Susa as souvenirs. Then, on the king's order, they put the whole sacred hill to the torch. The old temple of Athena burned. The Hecatompedon, the 100-foot shrine that stood where the Parthenon would later rise, burned. The wooden roof of the Erechtheion burned. Every shrine on the rock burned. White marble turned black. The painted faces of gods cracked in the heat and fell from their pedestals into the ash. An olive tree planted, by tradition by Athena herself, was reduced to a charred stump. From his camp at Phaleron, miles to the south, Xerxes could see the glow against the night sky. The cultural center of Greece, the place where Solon had written his laws and Cleisthenes had drawn up the framework of democracy a generation earlier, was now a torch. A black column of smoke climbed into the air and could be seen from the headlands of Aegina across the bay. It was a message written in fire, an insult so loud it screamed for an answer. Xerxes believed it was finished. He sent a courier east to Susa to announce the fall of Athens. The Persian capital, according to Herodotus, erupted into a festival that lasted days. Streets were strewn with myrtle. Wine flowed in the gutters. The empire celebrated the conquest of a city its army still stood inside, not yet knowing that a thin strip of water a few miles from those ruins would unmake everything. All that remained in his mind was the destruction of the Greek fleet hiding in the narrow water near Salamis. He ordered a golden throne carried up the slope of Mount Aigaleos so he could watch the show from above. The mountain rose 900 feet over the strait, giving him a clean view of the channel between the island and the Attic coast. Scribes sat beside him on folding stools, ink ready, prepared to record the names of the captains who killed the most Greeks. Cassius Dio, writing centuries later, noted that this was a man who liked his slaughters documented. He had received intelligence from a turncoat Greek messenger that the enemy fleet was breaking up in panic and planning to slip away in the dark. The messenger was a household slave of Themistocles named Sisinus, who would later be rewarded with citizenship in the city of Thespiae for the lie he delivered that night. The Greek captains were not running. They were waiting in the coves with their hands on the oars. Fewer than 400 ships, by the most generous count. Aeschylus, who was a marine on board one of those triremes and would later write the play The Persians about that morning, gives the count as 310. They watched as the first wave of Persian galleys, more than 800 in total, pushed into the choke point of the strait. The walls of land closed in on either side. The Persian commanders had argued against entering the narrows. Artemisia of Halicarnassus, the only female captain in the entire fleet and a personal favorite of Xerxes, had warned him to wait. "Let the Greek coalition crack on its own," she said. "Hold the position. Move on the Peloponnese by land." He thanked her for the counsel and ignored it. He believed the gods were in the throne with him. Then the signal cut through the morning. The Greek triremes came out of the inlets at full speed. They were smaller. They sat lower. They turned faster. They did not waste arrows. They did not try to board. They did one thing, again and again, with the precision of a butcher's cleaver. They rammed. Each Greek ship carried a bronze-sheathed beak under the waterline at the prow, a submerged spear the length of a man. When it struck a Persian hull at full stroke, the wood did not crack. It exploded. The sound coming off the water was not the sound of a battle. It was the sound of a forest being chewed apart, mixed with screaming. The first Persian line, under the command of Xerxes' own brother Aristodemus, was broken inside 10 minutes. Their long oars snapped against the Greek prows, and the men inside were thrown from their benches. Aeschylus, who was there, wrote of oarsmen with their hands still locked on the shafts as the splintered wood crushed their chests against their own benches. Hulls split below the surface. The sea poured in. The soldiers on those decks wore heavy bronze cuirass over leather. When they hit the water, they did not swim. They went down like anchors, mouths open, hands clawing at nothing. The strait at that point is around 40 fathoms deep. None of them touched bottom alive. The second wave of Persian ships came in behind them, blind to the wreck of the first, and slammed into their own retreating sister vessels. Then the third wave did the same to the second. The narrow channel that Xerxes had pictured as a sealed trap had become a slaughterhouse, with no exits. There was no room to turn, no room to retreat. There was only forward, into the bronze beaks. Artemisia, trapped in the press, was being chased by an Athenian trireme. To escape, she rammed and sank a Persian ship from her own side, a vessel under Damasithemus of Calinda. The Athenian captain, seeing her attack what looked like a Greek target, broke off the chase, believing she had defected. Xerxes, watching from the slope, saw the maneuver but did not see the flag. He turned to his courtiers and said the line Herodotus would preserve: "My men have become women, and my women have become men." From his golden throne, the god-king watched his invincible navy fold in on itself. His archers fired into clouds of friendly oarsmen. His marines drowned in their own armor. He saw his brother's flagship rammed amidships and shoved under the waves. Aristodemus died somewhere in the chaos. Days later, his body would be pulled out of the bay by Greek sailors and identified by the rings on his fingers. A small, intimate detail. A trophy. The historian Diodorus Siculus puts the Persian losses at 200 ships sunk and many more captured. The Greeks lost 40. Witnesses said Xerxes stood up from his throne and ripped his own robes. The sea he had whipped with leather was now eating his ships one by one. By sunset, the surface of Salamis was a crust of splintered planks, floating dead, and red water. The corpses of his Phoenician sailors washed up on the island of Citylea for weeks afterward. The local Athenians collected them with hooks and burned them in pits. When the surviving Phoenician captains crawled ashore to report, he had them beheaded on the beach. Their blood ran into the same sea that had just swallowed their men. He blamed cowardice. The remaining commanders in his fleet watched the heads roll and understood. There would be no honest counsel given to this king ever again. The Egyptian and Ionian captains who saw the executions began quietly preparing to defect. The aura of the god-king cracked that afternoon. In front of his own court, in front of his own scribes. A cold seed was planted in him at Salamis, a new thought he had never carried before. Fear. He started picturing the Greek fleet sailing north. He pictured them reaching the Hellespont, burning his bridges, trapping him and every man under his command on the wrong continent. He stopped thinking about conquest. He started thinking about getting home. Themistocles, sensing the panic, sent Sisinus across the water a second time. A new lie. "Stay calm," the slave told the king. The Greeks were planning to sail north and destroy the bridges, but Themistocles had talked them out of it. The king should depart quickly while the way remained open. It was the most expensive piece of false intelligence ever delivered. Xerxes believed it because he wanted to. He handed his best 300,000 men, including the surviving immortals, to his top General Mardonius. The orders were to winter in Thessaly and finish the war in the spring of 479 BC. Then Xerxes turned his face toward Asia and ran. The march back was not a withdrawal. It was a collapse. The supply chain that had fed the army on the way in had been stripped clean by that same army. There was nothing left in the fields. Soldiers ate the roadside grass. When the grass was gone, they peeled bark from trees and boiled the leaves into a green broth. Some ate the leather of their own belts. Then hunger handed them off to disease. Dysentery moved through the column. Plague followed. Herodotus writes of villages where the locals woke to find dying Persians piled in their squares, vomiting blood, begging for water. The shoulder of every road north was lined with the bodies of men who had once worn the king's colors. Wolves and vultures tracked the march for weeks. The man who had crossed into Europe at the head of the largest army in history was now leading a parade of corpses. This channel exists because someone has to tell these stories without sanding off the sharp edges. Producing investigations at this depth takes time, research, and a refusal to cut corners. It is a fight against the algorithm and against the version of history that gets watered down for safer rooms. If you believe these chapters deserve to be told in full, with the weight they actually carried, then there is a place for you inside our inner circle. It is called the lineage. It is more than a membership. It is a declaration. Members of the lineage are the patrons who keep this flame burning. You get early access to every new documentary and other perks reserved only for the circle. Click the join button below and take your place inside the work. Help us keep building the best dark history channel in the world. When Xerxes finally reached the Hellespont, the sea answered him one last time. A storm had come through during his absence. His great bridges, the floating roads he had built across the strait to prove that water obeyed him, were gone. Ropes snapped. The papyrus cables had rotted in the autumn rain. Boats scattered down the coast in pieces. The man who had branded the sea now stood on the shore with no way across. There was no procession, no golden chariot, no honor guard. The King of Kings, the Lord of every land from the Indus to the Aegean, pressed a few coins into the hand of a local fisherman near the town of Abydos and climbed into a small wooden boat. He crossed the water like any other refugee. Hood up, head down. The fisherman, by one tradition preserved in later sources, was executed once they reached the eastern shore, so that no one alive could describe how the god-king had come home. He had survived. His pride had not. But the war he had started was not finished. South of him, in the cold fields of Thessaly and Boeotia, Mardonius was settling his 300,000 killers into winter quarters around the town of Thebes, whose pro-Persian aristocrats welcomed the army with open granaries. The immortals were sharpening their blades by firelight. They were not retreating. They were resting. When the snow melted in the spring of 479 BC, they would finish what their king could not. They would burn what Athens had left. The temples on the Acropolis would be torched a second time, just to be certain. They would put chains on every Greek mother and child they could catch and march them east. They would erase the memory of Salamis from the face of the earth. The worst was still in front of Greece. And in Sparta, in a stone house no neighbor would visit, where no fire burned because no neighbor would lend a flame, a man called the Trembler sat alone in the dark. He held a shield across his knees. He worked an oiled rag over the bronze in slow circles. He did not look up when the wind moved the door. He was polishing the metal until he could see his own face in it. He wanted to be sure he would recognize it on the day he finally died. In Sparta, the news of what had been done to Leonidas did not arrive as a report. It arrived as a wound. A king's head on a pike, eyes open to the south, was not a tactic. It was a violation of every code the city had been built on for 400 years, since Lycurgus had handed down the laws that bound every male citizen to the spear. The Spartan answer could not be war. War was too small a word for it. It would be a blood feud carried out by an entire state. The man chosen to carry it was Pausanias, the nephew of the dead king, the son of Cleombrotus, Leonidas's younger brother, who had marched home from the Isthmus of Corinth after building a defensive wall there in the autumn of 485 BC and had died of natural causes within weeks of his return, possibly broken by an omen he had seen during a sacrifice. The crown passed to Leonidas's small son, Pleistarchus, a boy too young to walk under a hoplon, let alone direct a campaign. The regency passed sideways into the hands of Cleombrotus's son. That made the work personal in two directions. Pausanias was avenging an uncle. He was also holding a throne in trust for a child cousin who would one day grow up and ask him what he had done with the blood that was owed. Sparta placed in his hands the largest force of full Spartiates the city had ever fielded in one campaign. 5,000 of them, each one trained from the age of 7 inside the agoge, the state schooling system that took boys from their mothers and put them in barracks. They were fed on a thin barley gruel called the black broth. They were taught to steal food at night and beaten in public if they were caught. At 12, they slept on reed beds they had cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas. At 20, they entered the Syssitia, the mess clubs where a man ate every meal of his adult life beside the same 14 men, and where his rejection by a single vote of black beans meant he was no longer a Spartiate at all. Beside these, 5,000 walked another 5,000 perioikoi. The free non-citizens of the surrounding country, raised in villages like Amyclae and Githaion, also expected to fight when the city called. Around them moved 7 helots for every Spartiate, state-owned slaves drawn from the conquered Messenian population to the west. They carried the food. They carried the spare shields. They carried the bronze cauldrons that boiled the evening meal. And when the line needed to be thickened, they would be handed weapons and pointed at the enemy. The whole machine of Sparta was emptying itself into one column. Inside that column, in a file with men who would not speak his name, walked Aristodemus, the Trembler, the survivor, the man given a second life by an eye infection that had blinded him in the days before the last stand at the hot gates. There had been 2 such men, Herodotus tells us, Aristodemus and a Spartiate named Eurytus. Eurytus, when he heard the Persians had taken the goat path, had ordered his helot to lead him by the hand back to the line. He had died blind, swinging his sword at sounds. Aristodemus had stayed in the rear camp at Alpani. He had come home. His messmates would not pass him bread at the campfires. When he stretched out his hand for the wineskin, the man beside him let it fall to the ground, rather than place it in his palm. The law in Sparta was specific. A coward could not buy or sell. He could not marry. If he had a wife, no man would give a daughter to his sons. He had to wear a cloak patched with different colors so that strangers could see his condition at a glance. He had to shave half his beard and let the other half grow. He had to step aside in the street for younger men. At night, on the march north, he laid his cloak apart from the others. No one shared body heat with a dead man. He was not walking to save Greece. He was not walking to break Persia. He was walking to find a way to die so loudly that no one in Lacedaemon would ever speak the word Trembler again. He sharpened his short Xyphos sword with a river stone in the evenings, working the edge until it would shave the hair from his forearm. He oiled the inside of his shield, where the leather grip met the bronze rim. He prepared his body the way another man might prepare a corpse for the funeral pyre. 2 quests moved north along the same road. A city looking for blood vengeance, a man looking for a clean way out of his own skin. Neither was looking for survival. Mardonius had not been waiting. Through the winter of 480 into 479 BC, the Persian general had quartered in Thessaly. He had consulted oracles across the region. He had sent a man called Mies of Euripus on a tour of the Greek shrines to gather their answers in writing. The reports came back contradictory and bleak. He suppressed them in front of his officers. In the spring, he moved south through Boeotia and reoccupied Athens. The Athenians had returned to their ruined city after Salamis to begin scraping the ash off their foundations. He pushed them out a second time and torched what had been raised from the burned ground. He sent an envoy named Alexander Thurfer of Macedon, the same man who had been a guest friend of Athens for years, to offer generous terms: land, autonomy, a privileged seat inside the Persian system. The Athenian assembly, meeting on Salamis, voted to refuse. One council member, a man named Lycidas, suggested the offer should at least be brought before the people for debate. The others stoned him to death where he stood. Then the Athenian women, hearing what their husbands had done, walked together to the house of Lycidas. They stoned his wife. They stoned his children. That was the temperature of the war by the early summer of 479 BC. Mardonius read the refusal and pulled his army north into Boeotia, near the small town of Plataea. The plain there is flat, open, dry in summer, threaded by the slow brown current of the Acropolis River. The land is rust-red in the heat, and the soil cracks. The hills of Cithaeron rise to the south in steep folds covered in oak and pine. The plain was country-built for horses. Country-built to neutralize the one thing the Greeks were better at than anyone in the known world. Standing in close-packed formation behind a bronze wall of shields. When Pausanias arrived with the allied army and took position on the lower slopes of Cithaeron, the two forces froze. The Athenian contingent was led by Aristodemus, the same statesman whom the Athenians had ostracized 3 years earlier for being too rigidly virtuous, and whom they had recalled in the panic of 480 BC when they realized they needed him. Aristodemus commanded 8,000 hoplites on the left wing. The Tegeans, 1,500 strong, held the position next to the Spartans on the right. Corinthians, Sicyonians, Megarians, Phliasians, Troezenians, men from Eretria and Chalcis, Plataeans defending their own fields, all filled out the center. 40,000 hoplites in total, by Herodotus's count, with perhaps another 30,000 light troops behind them. Against them stood, by Herodotus's likely inflated number, 300,000 Persians and Persian allies. Modern estimates trim that figure down sharply, perhaps to 70 or 80,000 combatants. Either way, the disparity was real. The smaller army held the high ground. The larger one held the plain. The river ran between them. For 10 days neither side crossed. Mardonius would not climb the hill. Pausanias would not come down off it. The general began to bleed his enemy. He sent his cavalry, the finest mounted force in the known world, Medes and Persians on Nisaean horses, bred in the high pastures of the Median plateau, animals trained from foals to stand under javelin fire, Bactrian lancers with long ash shafts, Sakai horse archers with bow cases at their hips and quivers of cane shafts tipped in iron. They rode at the Greek line in shifts, all day, every day, from the moment the eastern sky brightened. They threw javelins into the front ranks. They emptied quivers into the men behind. They wheeled before the Greek hoplites could close the distance to use their long spears. On the third day, the section of line held by the Megarians, 3,000 men under a commander whose name has not survived, began to come apart under the volleys. They sent a runner up the slope to Pausanias, asking for relief or for permission to fall back. The Persian cavalry that day was led by Mecistius, a man of enormous size, his name preserved in Persian sources as Masishta, 6 feet tall and broad through the shoulders in an age when the average soldier stood 5.5 feet. He rode at the head of his squadron on a Nisaean stallion whose bridle was worked with gold plates the size of coins. His own coat was made of golden scale over an inner shirt of iron rings, all of it covered by a crimson tunic. He rode without a helmet, so the Greeks would know who was killing them. He called them women. He called them slaves. He invited them by name to come down and die. Pausanias sent 300 picked Athenians, the cream of the hoplite class, under a commander named Olympiodorus, son of Lampon. He also sent a body of archers, an unusual choice for a Greek force, but the only counter available to mounted bowmen. The next charge came in. An arrow took the Nisaean stallion in the flank, just behind the saddle blanket. The animal screamed, reared, and threw Mecistius onto the dirt of the riverbank. Before he could rise, the Athenians were standing over him. They drove their spears at his chest. The points skidded off the gold scales and bent against the inner iron. The man inside the armor lay on his back like a beetle, swinging his arms, kicking, refusing to die. One of the Athenians finally crouched over him, looked into his face, and drove the point of his sword down through the eye-hole of the cheekpiece. The blade went deep. The body went still. His own men, riding back to regroup, looked over their shoulders and saw their commander on the ground. They came off their horses to take him back. What followed was a brawl in the mud over a corpse. Persian cavalrymen, dismounted, fought hand-to-hand against Athenian hoplites in heavy panoply. They clawed at the gold plates. They dragged Mecistius by the wrists. The Athenians dragged him back by the ankles. Spear shafts splintered against scale armor. A Persian officer named, in some accounts, Phalanx, went down beside his commander with a spear point lodged in his throat. Greek reinforcements came down off the slope, jogging in formation, and tipped the balance. The Persians broke and rode back across the Acropolis, leaving Mecistius in the dirt. The Greeks stripped the gold scale armor from him. They laid the body, all 6 feet of it, in an open cart. Then they walked the cart along the whole length of their line, slowly, so every contingent could see the dead giant. Plutarch tells us the men in the ranks cheered as the cart passed. They climbed onto the shoulders of taller men to look down at the corpse. They reached out to touch the gold scales that had not, in the end, saved him. The taunting voice from the riverbank had a face now, and the face was dead. That night, the Persian camp went silent. Mardonius ordered the cavalry to cut their hair as a sign of mourning. They cut the manes of their horses too. The mules of the baggage train were sheared bare. The wails of the cavalry contingent, Herodotus says, carried across the river, and the Greeks on the slope could hear them in the dark. It was a real victory. It was also a small one. Mardonius had a longer game in his hand, and Mecistius had been only a piece of it. The Greek coalition was a fragile thing, strung together by mutual fear and short-term agreements. It was held in the field by the food and water that came down over the passes of Cithaeron behind them. The route ran through a narrow defile called the Three Heads, where 2 mule tracks merged into one. A column of 500 pack animals was bringing up the next week's grain through that pass. Mardonius's intelligence found them. A cavalry force under an officer named Leonidas, a Theban collaborator who knew the country, swung wide around the Greek position, came up behind the line of march in the narrow gully, killed the small guard of perhaps a few hundred men, and took the entire convoy. The mules were driven off to the Persian camp. The Greek guards who survived the ambush were left where they fell, their throats opened with curved knives. In one afternoon, the army on the high ground was put on rations it did not have. Then Mardonius reached for the throat. His scouts had identified the Gargaphian spring, a single source of fresh water, rising at the foot of the Asopus ridge that fed 40,000 men and their animals. He sent his cavalry to it before dawn. They rode through the Spartan pickets in the half-light, dismounted, and went to work on the spring with shovels and stones. They filled the pool with dirt. They threw in the carcasses of the mules they had just captured and could not feed. They fouled what they could not fill. By the time the Spartan reserve came down off the slope and drove them off, the Gargaphian was finished. Thirst is a faster enemy than any army. It kills morale before it kills bodies. The summer sun on the Boeotian plain pressed down at well over 30 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. The wind off the plain was hot and carried fine dust that worked into the eyes and the cracks of dry lips. The mules tied to the picket lines began to die first, their tongues swelling out of their mouths. Then the men began to crack at the lips. Helots sent to the riverbank to fill water skins were picked off by Persian horse archers in twos and threes, their bodies floating downstream in the brown current. On the evening of the 10th day, Pausanias gathered his commanders on the bare slope where his tent had been pitched. The wind moved the canvas walls. Outside, in the dimming light, the camp was almost silent. There was no clatter of cooking. There was no water to boil. He could not stay. He would be dried out and starved within days. He could not cross the river and attack into open country where the cavalry would tear his phalanx apart before the spears could close. He had one move left. He would pull the whole army back in the dark. A short night march to a new position called the Island, a piece of higher ground closer to Plataea, where springs were plentiful and the broken terrain would shield his flanks from cavalry. The center of the line, the less reliable allied contingents from cities like Corinth and Sicyon, would move first. The Athenians on the left and the Spartans on the right would peel back last as a rearguard. It was the right plan. It was also one of the most dangerous orders a Greek general ever gave. A night withdrawal in front of a superior enemy was a thing armies died doing. Units lost each other in the dark. Signals were missed. Formation broke and could not be rebuilt before dawn. If you want to feel what it was to stand inside that line at Plataea, the source material is the thing to put your hands on. The book that built the foundation of this script is a monolithic account of the Persian Wars. It traces every decision Pausanias made, every miscalculation Mardonius walked into, every drop of blood that soaked into the cracked dirt of the Asopus plain. It is the definitive version of these 48 hours. You can have a copy in your house this week. Click the View Products button below the video. Beside it on the shelf, you will find a curated set of themed relics chosen to sit alongside this period of iron and fire. The collection moves. I cannot tell you exactly what is on the shelf the day you are watching. Open the shop, look for yourself, and pick what belongs in your hands while the rest of the story plays out. The retreat broke the moment it began. The contingents in the center did not pull back to the assigned position. They ran. They convinced themselves the army was already destroyed. They did not stop at the island. They kept moving, breaking from a walk into a jog, and from a jog into a full run, until they were inside the walls of Plataea itself, breathless, helmets in their hands. They left a gap in the middle of the Greek formation a mile wide. On the right wing, the situation was worse. A Spartan officer named Amampharitus, son of Poliadas, who commanded the company of Pitana, planted his shield in the dirt and refused to move. To withdraw, he said, was to flee. To flee was to dishonor the city. He did not care what the regent had decided. He was a Spartiate, and Spartiates did not turn their backs to barbarians. Pausanias stood over him through the small hours of the morning. He argued, he reasoned, he demanded. According to Herodotus, Amampharitus picked up a heavy stone with both hands, the kind used to mark a vote in the assembly, and dropped it at the regent's feet. With this pebble, he said, I cast my vote against retreat. The other Spartan officers stood around them watching, unable to override the captain of Pitana without splitting the army in two. The eastern sky began to gray. A thin band of light appeared over the Boeotian hills. Pausanias finally turned his back on Amampharitus and ordered the main Spartan body to march. He counted on the stubborn officer following once he saw he had been left alone in the dark with 300 men. Eventually, Amampharitus did move. He followed at a walk, sullen, his men in formation behind him. But by then, the sun was up over the ridge, and the dust of the Spartan column was visible across the river. Across the Asopus, Mardonius came out of his tent and looked at the empty hill. The high ground that had held a Greek army for 10 days was bare. The slopes were empty. The picket fires were burned down to ash. His scouts came back at a gallop and shouted what their eyes had seen. The enemy was strung out across the plain in broken pieces. The center was nowhere to be seen. The right wing, the Spartans, was crawling across open ground in daylight, half a mile from any support. Mardonius did not pause to think. He saw in that one image the war ending in his favor. The defeat at Salamis erased, the shame of the king restored. The campaign closed before the autumn rains. He turned to the officers around him. "Victory," he said, "is ours." He gave the signal for general advance. Every unit at his disposal. The Persian native infantry in their wicker shields and embroidered tunics. The Median spearmen in scale. The cavalry already saddled and rested through the night. The collaborator Greeks from Thebes, under their commander Asopodorus. The Thessalians, the Sakai, the Bactrians, all of them, the whole machine. The Asopus disappeared under hooves. The plain shook. Dust rose in a wall 30 feet high. A wave of more than 100,000 men aimed itself at 5,000 Spartans walking in the open. Aristodemus, somewhere in that small bronze line, lifted his head. He could see the dust on the horizon. He could hear the noise of it, a low rolling thunder that came up through the soles of his sandals before it reached his ears. He set his shield against his shoulder. He looked once down the line at the men who had refused his name for a year. Then he smiled. The ground began to shake. Mardonius came at the head of the charge himself. 1,000 Persian noblemen rode and ran around him, the elite of his army, the men who had been chosen from the empire's best families to die at his shoulder. Among them was his son-in-law Artontes. Beside him rode Hydarnes the Younger, whose father had led the immortals up the goat path at Thermopylae the previous summer. Behind that corps, the rest of the army broke into a run across the open plain. War cries went up in 20 languages: Median, Bactrian, Persian, Theban Greek, Egyptian, Lydian. The Asopus River disappeared under their boots and hooves. The water turned brown from churned silt before the last of the column had crossed. What they saw ahead of them was a small crimson knot in the open. The Spartans and the Tegeans, 1,500 Tegeans on the right of the Spartan position, all of them strung out on level ground east of a low rise the locals called the Argiopion. Half a mile from the Athenians, a mile from the broken center. To Persian eyes, this was no longer a battle. It was a harvest. The cavalry reached the Greek position first and rode in a circle around it, throwing javelins as they went, never closing. Behind them, the Persian foot archers came up at a jog and planted their sparabera shields in the dirt. Tall rectangular walls of woven wicker faced with leather, the height of a man, locked together to form a temporary palisade across the plain. From behind that wall, 10,000 archers began to shoot. The Persian quiver held 30 arrows. Within minutes, 300,000 shafts had been loosed. The sky went out. The sound, Herodotus tells us, was the hiss of a hailstorm that did not end. Arrows struck shields and made the bronze ring like a hammer on an anvil. Arrows struck helmets and snapped the heads of the men inside them sideways. Arrows found the gap between greave and thigh, between cuirass and arm, between cheek-piece and beard. Men went down with shafts buried in their groins. A Tegean officer named Chileos, a guest friend of Sparta, who had urged the ephors to send the army out in the first place when they were dragging their feet over the Hyacinthia festival, took a shaft through the bridge of his nose and was dragged to the rear by his shield-bearer. He bled out before the next sacrifice was opened. The Greeks did not break. They did the thing they had been built to do. They locked their hoplons together in the formation called the synaspismos. They lowered themselves into a crouch beneath the rim. They held. A Spartan in the front rank carried his shield on the left arm in such a way that half of it covered his own body and half covered the body of the man on his right. The line was therefore an interlocking promise. It was the oldest contract in Lacedaemon. Pausanias stood behind the line and watched his men die under the volley. He could not give the order to advance. The sacrifice had not yet shown a favorable omen. In Sparta, this was not superstition. It was law. A general who attacked against the entrails was a general who would be tried in his own city afterward, if he lived. Cleomenes had been driven mad by such pressure 20 years earlier. King Demaratus had been deposed for less. Pausanias knew the precedents. Beside him, the diviner Tissamenus of Elis worked at goat after goat. The Spartans had paid an extraordinary price to recruit him. A prophecy from Delphi had told him he would win 5 great contests, and the Spartans had read the word contest as battle. They had offered him citizenship, an offer they had given to almost no foreigner in their history, and he had accepted it for himself and his brother Hagias. Now he was earning it under fire. He opened the liver of the first animal and shook his head. He opened a second. Another shake. The blood pooled at his sandals. The flies were already on it. The arrows kept falling. Tissamenus called for a third animal. The helots brought it forward by the horns. The knife went in under the jaw. The blood poured. The seer's hands went into the cavity and came out wet. He looked at the dark lobe of the liver and shook his head a third time. Down the line, the Tegeans began to crack. They were not Spartans. They had not been raised inside the agoge. They had been standing in the open for nearly an hour, taking the arrows, and they had begun to mutter that they could not hold any longer. A man named Antimolios, one of their captains, started forward on his own. 2 others followed him. The Tegean line bulged outward at one corner. Pausanias turned toward the temple of Hera, whose foundations could be seen on the slope to the south above the village of Hesiae, and prayed aloud. The temple was old. It had been raised by the Plataeans a century earlier in the time of the tyrant Hippias. He asked the goddess to forbid the Greeks the disgrace of dying without striking back. It is the one moment in this whole campaign where Herodotus records his voice in detail. He says the regent's eyes were on the stone of the pediment when he prayed. Tissamenus opened the 4th goat. He looked up. The omens were good. Pausanias gave the signal. A single flute note cut across the field. Then a second. Then the whole line of Spartan auletes, the flute players who marched with the army carrying the double pipe called the olos, took up the melody together. It was not a charge call. It was the embaterion, the marching tune that had been used in the Syssitia of Sparta for 2 centuries to teach boys how to walk in formation. Slow, even, inevitable. Tertius had set the words to it 3 generations earlier. The melody was old enough that the grandfathers of the men in the line had marched to it as boys. The Greeks rose from their crouch. They leveled their dorata, the 9-foot ash spears with the iron leaf head, and the bronze butt spike called the sorator, the lizard killer, used to finish wounded men on the ground. And they began to walk. Not run. Walk. The Persians saw the cornered animal stand up and come at them. They emptied their quivers faster. The arrows kept hitting bronze and turning aside. The wall of shields kept advancing, step by step. The flutes carrying the cadence across the plain, so that every right foot came down at the same moment, and the dust rose in a single line that lifted off the ground in a wave. When the phalanx hit the Sparabara wall, the wicker exploded. The hoplon was a heavy thing, 15 pounds of oak faced with hammered bronze, 3 feet across, called the Argive shield because it had been perfected in that city 100 years earlier. Driven forward by the weight of 8 ranks of men behind it, it went through the woven cane of the Persian shield wall the way a hammer goes through a basket. The front rank of Persian archers went down in the first second. Their bows were useless at arm's length. Many of them carried only a short dagger called the akanax at the belt. Then the spears came over the shield rims. A Spartan spearman did not duel. He did not parry. He had been trained since childhood to do one motion, underhand for the body, overhand for the throat and face. The man in front of him was already pinned by the shield of the rank to his right and could not turn. The point went in. The hoplite stepped over the body. The next man was in front of him. The Persian infantry wore quilted linen over their chests. The fortunate ones had scale of bronze or iron. None of it held against a Spartan thrust at arm's length. Men were spitted through the lung. Men were taken in the eye, and their helmets did not come off because the spear point was still in their skulls. The grinding sound of the phalanx pushing forward, the noise of bronze pushing through cloth and flesh and bone, was the constant under all of it. Herodotus, who interviewed survivors decades later, used the word othismos for what happened next. The push. The hoplites in the rear ranks set their shields against the backs of the men in front of them and shoved with their shoulders. The Persian line gave a foot, then 2 feet, then 10. In the middle of that grinding, Mardonius was visible to everyone. He rode a white horse. He had refused to dismount. Around him, the 1,000 bodyguards formed a ring and met the Spartan line with their own spears, fighting better than any other unit in the Persian army that morning. They were the picked sons of the noble houses of Persepolis and Susa. Many of them had grown up together in the Persian court. They had hunted lions together as boys in the royal paradises. They went down together too. A Spartiate from the village of Pitana, named Iamnestus, whom later sources also call Arimnestus, picked a stone the size of a man's head off the plain. The plain at Plataea is scattered with such stones, old riverbed material brought down from Cithaeron over centuries. He hefted it and threw it overhand. It crossed 40 feet of air and struck Mardonius in the temple. The crack was heard by the men around him. He went off the horse sideways and was dead before his shoulder touched the dirt. The 1,000 around him kept fighting for some minutes more, refusing to leave him. The Spartans killed them where they stood. When it was over, the bodies of the elite guard lay around the body of their general in a rough circle. Almost no Persian back wounds among them. Plutarch, writing his Life of Aristides 4 centuries later, says that the Spartans afterward called this circle the bed of Mardonius. The body of the general was not given back. A Greek of Aegina named Lampon would suggest to Pausanias that night that he should cut off the head and impale it on a pike to repay what Xerxes had done to Leonidas. Pausanias refused. He said such acts belonged to barbarians and not to Greeks. The line is the cleanest moment of the man's career, and it is the same man who, within 5 years, would be starved to death in a temple in Sparta for treason. But that is another story. Somewhere else in that pressing, screaming line, a man broke ranks. Aristodemus did the one act every Spartan boy is whipped for at the age of 7. He left the file. He shoved past the man in front of him. He pushed through the second rank, the third, the fourth, and came out alone in front of the formation. He did not lift his shield to cover the man beside him because there was no man beside him. He went into the Persian line by himself. Witnesses on the line, the men who survived to describe it to Herodotus a generation later, said he did not yell. He worked. He swung his xiphus in short, tight cuts. The xiphus was a short, straight sword, 2 feet long, the close-quarters weapon every hoplite carried on his left hip. He killed the first man with a thrust under the chin. He killed the second by hacking through the shoulder where the neck met the collarbone. He took spear thrusts to his thighs, his side, his upper arm, and kept moving forward. He was looking for a death that the entire army would see. He found it. 3 spears went into him at once. He fell forward across the bodies of the men he had already killed. His shield arm was still bent under his chest. The bronze face of the hoplon pressed into the Persian dirt he had marched 400 miles to die in. The death of Mardonius broke the Persian center. The body went down, and the line went with it. Men in the 2nd and 3rd Persian ranks saw the white horse run riderless. They turned. The turn became a step backward. The step became a run. Within minutes, the whole front of the army was streaming back across the plain toward the only place left to them. The fortified camp Mardonius had ordered, built weeks earlier on the north bank of the Acropolis, a square of timber palisade 4 stadia on each side, the gates set in the middle of each wall. The Spartans did not chase like wolves. They followed in formation. The flute kept playing. They killed the men who were too slow, or who tripped, or who turned to fight because they had nowhere else to go. Artabazus, the Persian general who commanded 40,000 troops on the left wing, watched the disaster and did not engage. He turned his column north and began marching for the Hellespont without a fight. Some of his men would reach Asia weeks later. Most would not. On the far side of the field, the Athenians under Aristides had been locked in a different battle. They had spent the morning against the Greek collaborators of the Persian army. The Thebans under Asopodorus, 300 picked men called the Hippes, the same Theban aristocracy that had welcomed Mardonius the previous winter with open granaries and silver bowls. The fighting on that wing had been hoplite against hoplite, a grinding of shield against shield, because both sides used the same equipment and the same tactics. 300 Athenians died on that ground, more than the Spartans lost in their entire engagement. A young Athenian named Sophanes of Deceleia distinguished himself there. He had come to the field with an iron anchor on a bronze chain fastened to the belt of his cuirass, which he would drop into the earth so he could not be moved. Herodotus reports the detail and calls it strange, and adds that Sophanes himself was killed 11 years later fighting in Thrace. When the Thebans finally broke and ran toward their city, Aristides did not pursue. He turned his contingent and marched it across the plain to meet Pausanias at the camp. The walls of the Persian camp were timber stakes lashed together with rope, the height of 2 men. The Spartans had no siege ladders. They had never trained for this. They threw themselves at the wall and were repelled, again and again, by archers shooting straight down from the parapet. Then the Athenians arrived. They had been doing this kind of work since the Ionian Revolt 20 years earlier. They had broken into Eretria when it was held by Persian garrisons. They knew how to find the join in a palisade where the cords had been knotted too loose. They knew how to lever a stake out of soft ground with a spear butt, while a comrade held a shield over their head. They knew the rhythm of the work. They went through the wall in 3 places. The thing that followed inside the camp was not a battle. The word battle implies 2 sides fighting. There was only one side fighting. Tens of thousands of Persians and camp followers were pressed together inside an enclosure of perhaps half a square mile, with no formation, no walls, no order. The Greek hoplites entered through the breaches and worked. Servants were killed beside soldiers. Cooks were killed beside captains. The Persian women who traveled with the army, the wives and concubines and laundresses, were killed in the tents where they had taken refuge. The horses tied to the picket lines were killed because there was nowhere for them to go. The wagons of supplies, the silver plate Mardonius had eaten from the night before, the cushions and the carpets brought from Sardis, were trampled into a paste of cloth and blood. Herodotus gives the figure of 3,000 survivors out of a force that had been some 40 times that number entering the camp. Even with his usual inflation, the meaning is the same. The Persian field army in Greece ceased to exist on the afternoon of an August day in 479 BC. Diodorus places the date in the month the Athenians called Boedromion. Plutarch fixes it on the 4th of that month. That same afternoon, hundreds of miles east across the Aegean, on a beach beneath the headland of Mycale, on the coast of Ionia, near the temple of Demeter, the Spartan king Leonidas landed marines against the beached remnant of the Persian fleet. The Ionian Greeks inside the Persian lines, the men of Samos and Miletus, turned on their masters at the moment the Greek hoplites came over the stockade. The ships burned to the waterline. The commanders Tigranes and Mardontes were killed in the rout. Artentes, who survived, would later be stabbed by his nephew in the throne room of Susa for the disgrace. The eastern arm of the war ended on the same day as the western one. The two messages reached the survivors of either field, by the old account, before the news of one had time to be carried to the other. Modern historians do not believe the coincidence is literal, but Herodotus, writing for an audience that had lived through it, did not invent the convergence. The two armies broke within hours of each other on the same August afternoon, on opposite shores of the same sea. The empire that had branded the Hellespont, that had carved a canal through Athos, that had sent its god-king to sit on a golden throne above Salamis, was finished in the west. In the field at Plataea, the spoils were counted. The pavilion of Mardonius was found intact, his bronze couches, his gold drinking cups, his ovens with the bread still in them, his eunuchs hiding behind the linen walls. Pausanias ordered his cooks to prepare a Persian meal, and his own helots to prepare a Spartan one in the same tent. And he laughed at the difference and showed it to his officers, and said this was what they had been fighting against. The line is preserved in Herodotus and Plutarch both, and it is one of the rare moments the regent's voice survives intact. A tenth of the gold was sent to Delphi and made into a tripod supported by 3 intertwined bronze serpents on a single column 30 feet high. The names of 31 Greek cities that had stood the line were carved into the coils. The column survived for over 800 years. It was carried to Constantinople by Constantine the Great in the 4th century AD and placed on the spine of the new hippodrome. The lower part of it still stands in that place today, in the modern city of Istanbul, the serpent heads long broken off, the bronze blackened by 26 centuries of weather, the names of the cities still readable on the coils. You can put your hand on it. When the Spartans sat down to award their own honors, they performed the calculation that only Sparta could perform. The prize for greatest valor was given to a man named Pausanias. He had fought brilliantly inside the formation. He had stood his ground. He had killed at the pace of the flute. Aristodemus, who had killed more men than any single Spartan on the field that day, was named second by some of the officers. Then the elders took the second place away from him. He had not fought for Sparta, they said. He had broken the line. He had wanted only his own death and his own erasure and the cleansing of his own name. A man who fights to clean his own shame fights for himself. A Spartan fights for the man on his right. The verdict was recorded, and the name of Aristodemus, even after the day at Plataea, was kept off the lists of the honored dead. His body was buried in the common pit with the other Spartiates who fell that morning. The pit was dug near a small rise that can still be identified on the modern plain. His grave was not marked separately. His blood had paid for his life, but his name did not come back to him. In the brutal arithmetic of Lacedaemon, those were two different debts, and the second one could not be settled by dying. Greece was free, the age that would build the Parthenon under Pericles a generation later, that would write the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, that would teach Socrates how to ask a question in the Agora of Athens, opened on the bones in the Boeotian plain. The tripod at Delphi stood for centuries, pointing back at this morning. The serpent column in Istanbul still does. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Your time is the most honest thing you can give a piece of work. And you gave it. If something in this hour landed for you, hit the like, subscribe to the channel so the next investigation finds you, and pass this video to one person who needs to sit with it tonight. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in the line at Plataea. Tell us whether the elders of Sparta were right about Aristodemus. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at the screen. Another documentary is opening beside this one. That is the next door. Click it and keep walking.